In this video, I'll be giving a tutorial and performing a walkthrough of Intune Autopilot specific to Microsoft Entra Hybrid Join. So what does that mean? Suppose you order a bunch of workstations and laptops from Dell or HP or Lenovo or any other vendor, and you want the out-of-the-box experience, the OOBE. You're going to start these computers up and you want everything automated. The system settings, the domain join, push some apps, etc. But you have on-premises AD, and you want those devices joined to AD instead of Entra ID. And in turn, you're going to sync those devices from AD to Entra ID instead of just directly joining to Entra ID. For instance, you might have file servers, print servers, SQL servers, application servers, and these workstations need to communicate with those servers as dependencies. All the same steps that you would use for Autopilot with Entra joined, directly joined to Entra ID are the same with some additional requirements procedures. Now, I must say that Microsoft does recommend against this, but it is supported, and it may be required for your objectives in your enterprise organization. The first time I pulled this off, it seemed a little complicated, but trust me, it works. We'll begin with an overview, and then we'll go over each step along the tutorial. So enough of this, let's jump right in. So we will begin with an overview and explanation of each step involved in the process. The very first thing that happens is during the sales phase, and it's crucial that the sales account manager is involved during the sales process for whatever vendor you're going with. You have to identify during the sales process that these devices that you are purchasing are intended for Autopilot. They have to grab the hardware hash from each device that you intend to use with Autopilot. The manufacturers will absolutely refuse to add them to your tenant as Autopilot devices post the sales phase, and in essence, you won't be able to deploy those as Autopilot devices unless you go through extreme measures to add them manually, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of using Autopilot. So it's extremely imperative that during the sales phase, you identify which devices you're going to use as Autopilot devices, and you identify those to the manufacturer to add them as Autopilot devices. Now, if the manufacturer fails to do that, then it's on them, and they're going to have to add them post-sales process as long as you went through that procedure, and we'll identify that procedure later on in this tutorial. We have to go into Active Directory and configure Group Policy GPO to automatically enroll your devices per the organizational unit that you have these devices in into Intune, so that we can deploy policies and profiles and applications and all that stuff post Autopilot deployment. So that's a necessary step as well. Entra Connect is a necessary prerequisite component for the hybrid join, for the devices to join from Active Directory to Entra ID, which used to be known as Azure AD. So what we have to do is we have to go into Entra Connect, and we have to do an additional configuration. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to configure Entra Connect to sync the devices to Entra ID, and in that fashion, you'll have your devices in both Active Directory AD and Entra ID, so that those devices are recognized to be able to be available for Autopilot and also deployment with the rest of Intune. We'll have to also install and configure the Intune Connector for AD. Now, this is also known as the domain join, Office domain join, ODJ connector. What this does is this connects Intune to Active Directory so that you can actually join the computers to Active Directory during the Autopilot deployment. We'll have to create a dynamic device group in Entra ID. And this group is going to be used to target our Autopilot devices. This gets a little confusing to some people because the assumption is, and it's a logical assumption, is why can't we just target the devices that were added to Intune directly, that the manufacturer added to Intune as the Autopilot devices, but it's not an actual group that we can target with policies for Intune for Autopilot deployment. So we have to create a dynamic device group, and you'll see how that's done with a dynamic query to take only Autopilot devices and put them into an Entra ID group so we can target a policy, an Autopilot policy that we're going to create later on. Next, we're going to create an Autopilot deployment profile. This is where all the settings are for your Autopilot deployment. Some of these settings are going to be limited because we're actually doing a domain join, hybrid domain join. And so we'll go through all of that. But this is the main settings profile for all your Autopilot deployment settings. We will configure a domain join profile. And this is going to be used in conjunction with the Intune Connector for AD, which basically says, okay, where are the devices going to go? Which organization and unit are they going to go into? What account is going to be used to join these to the domain and those kind of things, so that when the connector connects to AD through the software that's installed on a server for the Intune Connector for AD, what are the parameters used to authorize this, and the settings used as to where the devices are going to go and all that kind of stuff. We will also configure the enrollment status page, the ESP. It's optional, but highly recommended. This is the feature that displays a provisioning status to people enrolling Windows devices and signing in for the first time. Several options. We have options for blocking the device until all policies and applications are installed, the visibility of the progress, time limits, links to logs, all that kind of stuff. It is optional, but it's highly useful and highly recommended. The next step is to assign the deployment profile that we created to the dynamic device group that we created earlier. It's important to note that at this point, nothing's actually going to happen until we actually boot up the computers that were in the Intune Autopilot devices assigned from the manufacturer. Nothing's going to happen. But you don't want to boot up the computers until all these steps have been accomplished. So the actual out-of-the-box experience, OOBE, is a trigger for all the stuff that we're doing up to this point. So this next to last step is a little tricky. From my experience, most apps can be assigned to the Autopilot deployment process. But some apps, especially those that have UAC prompts that are necessary, cannot be deployed through the Autopilot process. So it really depends on the applications that you're trying to install. You could, if all the applications that you want to deploy could be assigned to the Autopilot dynamic device group that you created for the Autopilot profile, the apps can be assigned to that too. But if you find some of the apps fail in your testing and your piloting, then what you might want to do is create a separate group and a group in Entra ID and assign those apps to the Autopilot devices separately, whether it's a dynamic group or whatever, post the Autopilot phase, because they're going to fail. UAC has a problem deploying through the Autopilot phase. So keep that in mind, and we'll get into that a little bit later too. The last step in the process is to actually start the out-of-the-box experience, the OOBE. And this is where you boot up the computer that's already registered in Intune from the manufacturer as an Autopilot device. And you go through the testing and you see how it goes. So, you never start with all of your devices. I mean, that's just asking for disaster. You always start with testing, and then you go into some pilot devices. And my word of advice is that you do not in the enrollment status page, block devices during your testing and pilot device testing. Rather, just choose to allow them to continue the Autopilot devices, Autopilot rollout, and testing until you can see what has happened and troubleshoot any issues or errors or anything like that with the Intune logs and all that kind of stuff. And then once you've just tweaked it and perfected it, then you can roll it out to the rest of the production devices. Microsoft has this whole process well documented, so check out the link below. So anyways, let's get on to the rest of this. Let's check out each step, and let's check out the little gotchas here and there, and let's get into it. As mentioned in the overview, the very first step is that the vendor is going to have to register the devices into Autopilot. Microsoft outlines the process in the following article. And you can check out the URL shown here. The important thing to realize is that there's 2 steps that need to happen. And these steps are shown right here. Okay, so the device hardware identity, known as a hardware hash, has to be captured by the vendor during the time of purchase. And the second step is the device is associated to an Azure tenant ID. That's your tenant, your Azure tenant. So all of that is handled by the vendor. The only thing the vendor needs, if you look further down in the article, is the registration authorization. So you may be required, if you're not going through a CSP, to authorize the vendor to upload those devices into your tenant, into Autopilot. If you click on the hyperlink, it'll bring you to some more information on that whole process, whether it's a CSP or an OEM, and the steps that are involved. Basically, you're authorizing the vendor, the OEM, to act on your behalf to add devices into your tenant. So the devices will then show up within a few minutes, maybe up to an hour, after the vendor adds them into your tenant. So you're probably going to want to know where they show up at and how to find them and get information on those devices in Autopilot. So go to intune.microsoft.com and sign into your tenant. And then you're going to go to Devices, then you're going to go to Enrollment, then you'll find them underneath Windows Autopilot, and Devices. In my tutorial, my walkthrough, I'm using my tenant, but I'm using a machine I built as a virtual machine in my lab. So I've only got one in there. I'm going to show you in a few minutes how you can manually do this in case, you have to re-register a machine in Autopilot, or you want to just follow along in your own lab, or repurpose some machines and use them for Autopilot. So we'll show you that in a little bit. But first, let's take a look at what information we're actually going to get by clicking on the hyperlink underneath each machine. So if we take a look at the information given here in the underneath each header, manufacturer, Microsoft Corporation, because that is a virtual machine, like I mentioned. If it were Dell or HP or Lenovo, it would tell you the manufacturer, the OEM, right there. Tells you right there the model of the virtual machine. But again, if it were an actual physical machine, it would tell you the model number. If there was a service tag, it would tell you underneath group tag. Notice we haven't assigned it to a profile yet, and that's pretty much the overview on this part. If we click on the hyperlink, there's a serial number, by the way, of the virtual machine. It'll give us a little more information underneath here. Some of this information will be filled out post Autopilot deployment, such as a device name, if you tagged it with a group tag. If once it goes through Autopilot, it'll tell you which profile it went through, the date, enrollment state, all that kind of stuff. So right now mine says enrolled, but that's because I'm actually haven't given it a fresh wipe yet to run the Autopilot. So and it tells you the machine name and all that kind of stuff. So again, if you just click on this hyperlink for the machine, that's how you get all the information. So let's take a look at how to manually register devices with Windows Autopilot. Browse to the URL shown here. And then what you're going to do is you're going to scroll down to the section where it says PowerShell, and to this section right here where it has the PowerShell script. You're going to copy that PowerShell script, and then you're going to go to your Windows virtual machine or your physical machine or whatever it is, and you're going to open PowerShell on that machine that you want in listed in Autopilot devices, and you're going to open PowerShell as an administrator and paste this in. You're going to collect the hardware hash from that machine to that local machine as a CSV file, and then you're going to upload that into Intune. So we'll show you that whole process. Now, yes, you could probably put this into a script and, you know, deploy it with like SCCM, MECM, or some other systems management tool, or even group policy, and then collect all those scripts and then upload them and kind of semi-automate it. So, you know, it's possible to be done, but this really should be like a one-off process. This is not something that should be done on a regular basis. So now that I've copied those commandlets from that PowerShell script, basically a script, I'm going to pull up my Windows virtual machine. I'm going to run terminal in Windows 11 as admin, which is really just PowerShell, combined with, and at the UAC prompt say yes, combined with the command line. I'm just going to paste and hit yes to any prompts you might get, if you get any. Okay, and if you notice, it's saved it into the output file. So it downloaded the script. I already had remote signed enabled, so it didn't prompt me to authorize remote signed. Downloaded and installed the script, and then saved it to the C drive underneath CHWID, which is shown in the script right here for the path. And it saved it as the output file of this. So all we have to do is go and find that file and upload it into Intune. So let's go grab this. Let's copy this CSV file, put it somewhere where we can locate it and upload it into Intune. So now we're going to go back to the same place we were in for our Autopilot devices in Intune. And all we're going to do is click on import and then follow the prompts. So if we click on import, it's going to ask us where that file is. So I changed the location of it because I grabbed it from my virtual machine and put it on my other computer. I grabbed that file. And now this is important. Notice it's going to tell you right here whether it passed the formatting check. And it did. So all we have to do, once it passes and you validate that hardware hash is in there correctly, is click on import. So I'm not going to do that because I've already done that. That's why this machine is showing up. And that's all there is to it. And now that machine is going to show up in your Windows Autopilot devices. So that's all there is to this part. Let's move on to the next step. So what we'll do next is we're going to create and configure a group policy in Active Directory for automatic enrollment into MDM Intune, so that when directory synchronization occurs, whatever organizational units you specify, when they sync, they will automatically enroll in Intune so that Intune can manage them as the MDM authority. Now, you might already have this configured in your AD environment. So if that's the case, then you can just skip this whole step. In order for you to create and configure this group policy, you're going to need at least the Windows 10 administrative templates. I always recommend having the latest administrative templates. So I recommend having the Windows 11, latest administrative templates at the time of the build. And you'll be sure to have the templates that are needed for anything you want to configure with group policy. But you'll surely have the templates that accommodate the group policy that we need to configure for this example. So let's go ahead and open the Group Policy Management Console from the Windows Administrative Tools on a domain controller. We're going to expand the domain that we need to work with. And then we're going to work with the organizational unit that we want to create the group policy in. So we'll start with one organizational unit and create a group policy in there, specifically for this automatic MDM enrollment. And then later on, we can take that group policy and link it to other organizational units. We're going to right-click the organizational unit, and we're going to select Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. We'll call it something like MDM Automatic Enrollment, and hit OK. And then we're going to go ahead and expand, find that group policy, and then edit it. So we're going to go to Computer Configuration, then Policies, then Administrative Templates, then Windows Components, then scroll down to MDM, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the policy setting for Enable Automatic MDM Enrollment using default Azure AD credentials. We're going to double-click on this, and all we need to do is simply click on Enabled and take the default settings, and hit on OK. And now our policy is created and configured. That's all there is to that. If we want to link this policy to a different, an additional organizational unit, all we have to do that contains computers, obviously, is we would click on the other organizational unit that we want to link that policy we just created, and right-click and say link an existing GPO, and then go to automatic MDM enrollment and hit OK. And so you could just continually add additional organizational units to link this group policy to. And that's all there is to this. So on to the next step. Now that we've configured the group policy for automatic MDM enrollment, we have to configure Entra Connect to sync the devices to Entra ID for the Autopilot devices once they go through the provisioning stage and get joined to Active Directory AD. Again, this might have already been configured in your environment, so if so, you can skip this step. What we have to do is we have to go back into the Entra Connect setup wizard on the application server which Entra Connect is installed on, and launch the wizard and select an additional configuration. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and click on Configure. And then we're going to click on Configure Device Options. Click on Next. Then Next again. And you're going to have to authenticate to your tenant. And of course, multi-factor authentication should be enabled for all administrator accounts. And by default, it is enforced by Microsoft. So you should get a pop-up window for multi-factor authentication MFA once you click Next in a browser window, and then you'll have to, use your multi-factor authentication method. We're going to select configure configure hybrid Microsoft Entra ID Join. Click Next. We're going to click on Windows 10 and later domain join devices. And click Next. We're going to have to select the authentication service for our forest. Select the forest and then select a Microsoft Entra ID. And then we're going to have to click on Add. Then we click Next. Well, first we have to authenticate to our forest, our AD forest. And lastly, we simply click on Configure and let it rip. And we see configuration is complete. So we can click on Exit. So we can wait for the sync schedule to sync our devices to Entra ID, or we can force a synchronization and validate that those devices have been synced to Entra ID. Now it's important, if you had not previously selected the organizational units that contain your devices to sync to Entra ID, you have to go back into Azure AD Connect Wizard and select those organizational units that contain the devices that you want to sync to Entra ID, and then finish and run a full sync. So when you finish a wizard, it'll run a full sync by default. Else they will not be synced. So let's go ahead and show you how to force an Azure synchronization, which is now known as an Entra ID synchronization. And by the way, the default synchronization schedule is every half an hour. So in our environment, we're not going to wait for half an hour to validate that those devices have synced. That's why we're going to force it through PowerShell. So let's open PowerShell as an administrator. And we're going to type the following command. So assuming that you've already done a full synchronization on the new organizational units that contain the devices to sync, then we're just going to run a delta on the devices to make sure they're all up there. Of course, the Autopilot devices won't be in there until the Autopilot provisioning completes, but at least we've got all of our ducks in a row for when that is going to happen, so that everything's in place. Let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so let's give that a couple of minutes and, and then validate. And that is the end of this section. And let's go on to the next section. We now need to install the Intune Connector for AD, also known as the Office Domain Join Connector. This functions to join computers to the AD domain during the Autopilot provisioning step. The hyperlink below lists all the steps involved in this process. The first thing we have to do is to turn off Internet Explorer Enhanced Security Configuration in short terms, the ESC, on the application server that is hosting the Intune connector. In my lab and in this demonstration, we're going to be using the domain controller to install the Intune connector. But in production environments, you do not want to do this for security protocols and best practices usage. So keep that in mind. So let's begin by turning off ESC. We're going to go to the server manager. We're going to go to local server. And we're going to go to IE Enhanced Security Configuration. We are going to turn it off for administrators. And we're done with that part. We now need to download and install the Intune connector for Active Directory. So, log into intune.microsoft.com with your credentials. Go to Devices. Windows. Enrollment. And scroll down to Intune Connector for Active Directory. Click on Add. Then click on the download link. Unblock and open the following file. Proceed to install the file. And close the dialog box. Next, we need to configure the Intune connector. So we'll go ahead and launch the Intune connector for Active Directory. And we'll have to sign in. The credentials you're going to use here need the role assignment for the at least the Intune administrator role. Obviously, a global administrator account would work, which is what I'm going to use for our lab purposes. But ideally, you want to use a least permissions model for the RBAC, role-based administration. You don't want to assign it too many permissions as a security precaution. Notice that it automatically created a managed service account. So if we went to Active Directory users and computers, underneath managed service accounts, we find it right here. Also notice that the account used must have an Intune license assigned to it. Very important. So don't forget, if you initially configured this for the user account to sign in to Entra ID, and it didn't have an Intune license, to assign that license to it. Finally, let's verify that the connector is active in your tenant. So we're going to go right back to the same place where we downloaded the connector. We're going to see the connector is installed, and what we're looking for is underneath status, that the status is active. You can also check out the last sync time and the version. That's all there is to installing and configuring the Intune connector for Active Directory. So let's move on to the next step. Next, we will create a dynamic device group in Entra ID. The device's membership will be based on a dynamic query, which queries all of the Autopilot devices that are listed in Intune. Recall that we're going to use this dynamic device group to target Autopilot for deployment profile, enrollment status page, ESP, and any desired applications. Sign in to portal.azure.com. Then click on Microsoft Entra ID. Go to Manage and expand it. Go to Groups. Go to New Group. We will call it something like Autopilot Devices. And we will change the membership type from assigned to dynamic device. We will click on Add Dynamic Query. We will click the Edit button and directly edit the syntax. then paste this syntax exactly as is. Then we will simply click on OK and save. And then create. Let's go back into Microsoft Entra ID, back into groups. Let's go to all groups. Do a search for Autopilot. Then click on Autopilot Devices. Then click on Manage. And click on Members. And we can see that our Autopilot devices are now in the dynamic device group that we can use to assign our deployment profile, our enrollment status page, and our applications to during the Autopilot provisioning. And that's all that there is to this step. So let's move on to the next step. We're now at the point where we will configure the Autopilot deployment profile. These are all the settings that we configure for how the Autopilot devices are going to be deployed during the deployment process for Autopilot. So we'll go back to intune.microsoft.com. We will go to Devices. Windows. Enrollment. And scroll down to Deployment Profiles. Click on Create Profile. And Windows PC. I'll just call it Test for this demonstration. And leave the other defaults. And click Next. Most of these options we are going to leave at default, but we'll explain a couple of them along the way. We're going to need to change from Microsoft Entra Joined to Entra Hybrid Join for our scenario. You do not want to skip the AD connectivity check. We will be configuring the domain join profile later on. You want to make sure this step is completed. So it's important to make sure that you do not skip this. You also do not want to have an additional step during provisioning for accepting the software terms. So let's hide that. Same thing with the privacy settings. Also hide the count options. Just one less step that you need to do during provisioning. You want to leave the user account type as standard. You certainly don't want all Autopilot devices to have the users that are registering this to be administrators. You want them to be standard users. If you need certain users to be administrators on a local machine, you can either handle that through group policy or Intune profiles, configuration profiles after the fact. Leave the rest at default. Notice when it's hybrid joined, it's grayed out. You do not get to use a naming template for the computer name. Autopilot will give it a generic name, and we'll see that later on in this tutorial. It's just a limitation of a hybrid Entra joined AD Entra hybrid joined scenario for Microsoft at this point. So that will be an additional step that we'll cover later on. We will go ahead and click on Next. Skip this step for scope tags. And then in assignments, we're going to add the group for included groups. And then we will search for that dynamic device group that we called Autopilot. Select that. And we'll click Next. You can see that this configuration profile for Autopilot is going to be assigned to the Autopilot devices. Click Next. Just review your settings and go back if you need to, and then click on Create. And we see that the deployment profile has been created. Next thing we need to do is to verify that those Autopilot devices have this profile assigned to them. So we are going to go back to Devices. Enrollment. Scroll down to underneath Windows Autopilot, Devices again. We'll give it a few minutes to propagate. We see at this point that the status of profile assignment is pending. And we will wait until that's actually assigned, that device is assigned to the profile through the dynamic device group to the profile that we just created. And now we see that the machine is assigned. So, this could take up to a half an hour, 45 minutes, and it depends on how many actual machines you are assigning this profile to. Could take a little bit of time, a little while. You want to make sure that in all the Windows Autopilot devices, they're all assigned to a profile. If you find some that are not, that are still in the pending state after an hour or so, or they failed or something like that, then you'll want to do a little bit of troubleshooting. And now we've completed yet another step. So let's move on to the next step. So we're now ready to create and configure a domain join profile. It's important to realize a few things. This is not an Autopilot configuration profile. This is an Intune configuration policy template. It's not immediate. It happens post the Autopilot phase and depends on subsequent Intune synchronization with a machine and directory synchronization. It uses the Intune Active Directory connected and the managed service account. So in order to create this, we go to Devices, then Configuration, we'll create a new profile, policy, select the platform Windows 10 and later. Profile type is going to be a template. And we will search for domain join. And it's right there. And then we'll click on create. We'll call it something like domain join. Click next. And then we'll give it a prefix. I like to give it a prefix of Autopilot so that I know that these devices, even though I'm going to put them in a specified directory and organizational unit, that these were devices provisioned with Autopilot. The rest of the computer name, when Autopilot provisions these, will be randomly generated up to 15 characters. Then we fill in the FQDN, the fully qualified domain name of the Active Directory domain that they are joining. As well as the organizational unit that you want these devices to be placed into during provisioning. Stepping back for just a second, something I forgot to mention. On the prefix, you cannot use variables such as serial name or rand colon with the the percent symbols on the end and beginning to represent a variable. It does not accept variables. Although the organizational unit is optional, I highly recommend specifying it, especially if you have a large AD environment. Otherwise, it's just going to be those computers provisioned by Autopilot are just going to be placed in the default computers container, which isn't even a real organizational unit that you can apply group policy to and all that kind of stuff. And if you've got a lot of computers in there and you're not good at house cleaning, and it may be really hard to find those computers. So I highly recommend specifying the organizational unit. So let's go to Active Directory users and computers and grab the distinguished name attribute from the OU that we want these Autopilot provisioned devices to be placed into. And we'll simply paste that distinguished name, the DN, in there. Click on Next. We won't add any scope tags, so we'll click on Next. We will add a group for assignment, which is going to be the same dynamic device group for Autopilot that we used before to make it easy. For the include group, we'll search for that Autopilot group, click on it, select it, click Next. Next, review your settings, revise if you need to. Make sure that the included groups is there, and create. And that's all there is to the domain join profile and assignment. We're ready to move on to the next step. Now we will configure the enrollment status page, the ESP. This is optional but highly recommended. In short, this configures all of the options that you would see or configure for the out-of-the-box experience, the OOBE. When the user first boots up the computer after everything has been configured in Autopilot and wants that experience for the automatic provisioning that Autopilot provides. There are two phases to the ESP. The device ESP, which happens first. This is the portion that runs during the out-of-the-box experience and applies device policies and installs device applications. That is to say, applications outside of Autopilot that were assigned to devices and not users. The second phase is the user ESP. This is the portion that sets up the user account, applies the user policies, and installs user applications. Most of the time, when we deploy applications in Intune, we install to the device, not the user. However, if you're having problems with Autopilot, deploying applications during the Autopilot phase, you might want to either switch the application that's having an issue to user, if that works for that application, or assigning that application to the Autopilot devices separately post the Autopilot phase. The ones that I've seen, as we mentioned before, that are most troublesome are the ones that rely on UAC, because those cannot happen during the Autopilot deployment phase. That is to say, they require a UAC prompt to install. So let's go ahead and create, configure, and assign an enrollment status page. Go to Devices, Enrollment, and under Windows Autopilot, Enrollment Status Page. We will create a new enrollment status page. Call it whatever. Click Next. And very important, you have to select yes to get any options. Otherwise, it's just not going to have any options and just going to be very generic and no configuration available, and no troubleshooting options either. So we'll go ahead and do that. And here are all the options. Show an error when installation takes longer than the specified number of minutes. Now, this is going to depend on your deployment. And most specifically, depending upon not what happens during Autopilot, but what happens to Autopilot in the phase of the application deployment. That all the applications, how many applications that you have deploying and how long they take. So if you have a ton of applications and those applications take a long time, you might want to boost this up a little bit. If you don't have very many applications or none at all, you could actually take it down a little bit. Show custom message when time limit or error occurs. I'd say yes. And this also depends on your deployment scenario. Most of the time, us tech guys are going to be doing the out-of-the-box experience and then handing it to the end users. When we've had a completely successful deployment, we don't want end users running into unexpected errors during deployment. We want to fix those ahead of time and just hand the end users the devices that are completely deployed and configured. However, it may be your scenario where you've tested, piloted, and you're happy that the setup and configuration is stable, and you're deploying tens of thousands of computers, and you're not going to have your tech team go through every one of those computers. So in this case, you might want to customize this a little bit and have your support contact number and email address in there. So if that's the case, then I highly recommend that. If your tech guys are doing this, you can either select no or just leave it at the generic. Turn on log collection and diagnostic page for end users. Absolutely. What this will do is if there's a failure, it will, and it might just be a failure in a single application and the rest of it goes through, who knows? And again, this is why it's very important to do testing and piloting of certain users before you roll it out to production. And in that phase, it'll have a little pop-up window and says there's an error, and it'll actually have a link to where those log files are locally on that computer. Those log files will be collected locally on that computer, and you can reference those files for troubleshooting. So I definitely recommend turning that on and keeping that on. The next one, only show page to devices provisioned by the out-of-the-box experience. I recommend leaving that to yes. If you change it to no, let's say we provision this in Autopilot to a single user, and then another user logs onto it temporarily or one time or occasionally. Each subsequent user that logs into it will get prompted for the out-of-the-box experience. I don't think you want that in most scenarios. Let's scroll down a little bit. This one's an important one. Block device use until all apps and profiles are installed. My preference is to say no. And the reason for that is that this could greatly delay the provisioning process. Let's say that just one small issue that you could troubleshoot through the log files or testing the applications during your testing and piloting phases, you have to wait until it times out to know that. Also, I've seen that there are sometimes, or at least in one scenario, there's a bug with this. Don't know if Microsoft has fixed that yet, and you have to have the bug workaround implemented. In my opinion, I would prefer to just, like I said, test and see in the Intune status underneath the devices once it's deployed, if the applications and policies were all successful, and if not, check which policy failed where, check the local log files on that computer, then wait forever for it to time out. And if you do choose no, you get no options, no further options. If you do choose yes, then have further options. So let's just take a look at those options in case you do choose that path. So you have several options. Allow users to reset the device if installation error occurs. I would say yes on that. Allow users to use device if installation occurs. I'd say no. Unless you're still in the testing phase, and then you could actually allow the technician to log onto the computer and reset the device to basically the factory defaults to run Autopilot again. You know, a computer reset. And then you would select yes. And this one is interesting. If you're going to do this, I recommend selecting this, especially if you're troubleshooting the apps. Let's say there's one app that is having an issue, and I've had to do this in the past. If you find out in your testing that, 7 out of the 8 apps are installing and one is not, you can go in here and say, okay, block device until all required apps are installed if they are assigned to the user device. And then select the apps. If you say selected and not all, you can say only these apps have to pass and the rest of them can fail. And then you would just go in and select the apps that you need to absolutely pass installation during Autopilot. But for demonstration purposes and simplicity purposes, I'm actually going to go back up and select no, and get rid of the rest of the options. So again, what do we have? Show app and profile configuration progress, yes. 60 minutes is fine for my purposes. I would probably take it down to 30 for my purposes in the lab environment. Show custom error message, that's fine. Turn on logs, yes. Only show page to devices provision on the out of the box experience, OOBE. Yes, you don't want every user getting prompted with OOBE. And do not block devices. That's what I'm going to set it at for this demonstration and walkthrough. We will click on next. Okay, we need to assign it to that Autopilot dynamic device group we created earlier. Just like we did every time before. Search for it. Select it. Next. Next. Review and create. Now we have the ESP created, configured, and assigned. So this step is complete. Let's jump right into the next topic. Before we move on to the demonstration, I'd like to remind you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell for new content. If you feel really motivated to support this channel, you can always buy me a cup of coffee as a patron through the link below. It really does help to keep the channel and the content going. Leave a comment below, whether that may be a question or something you ran into in the field or a thumbs up or whatever. Technology is always changing and feedback from the field is always welcome. Thank you, and keep checking back for new content. And now on to the next section. So now that we've installed and configured everything that's necessary, we're at the point where we can first test and then roll out to pilot devices and then ultimately roll out to production. When in the testing and pilot phase, we have two options. We can either choose to roll out to one or two devices and test in the production devices that have been configured and assigned in the Autopilot devices, or we can choose to modify our Intune deployment policy and our ESP profile to include only those devices that we want to test and pilot. At this point, we certainly do not want to start up all the computers that are Autopilot devices and just kind of wing it. We need to go through adequate testing and piloting before we hammer down all the issues that we may encounter and resolve those issues before rolling out to full-blown production deployment. All that's necessary for the initial testing is to boot up to start one of the devices that's listed in the Autopilot devices and go through the testing. In our demonstration, we only have one device. And since we're using a virtual machine that we grab the hardware hash from, and we don't have an actual machine that we grabbed or that the OEM manufacturer added to our tenant before we actually boot it up for the first time, we're going to have to go through an Autopilot reset. So if you're following along in your lab environment, what we're going to have to go through is an Autopilot reset for our demonstration and lab purposes. In most scenarios, you wouldn't have to go through this, just used for demonstration purposes. We're going to trigger an Autopilot reset. This machine was joined to Entra ID to simulate what the out-of-box experience would be as if you were putting up a machine that was added from the OEM manufacturer for the first time. If you are following along in your own lab environment, it's important that that virtual machine that you created or physical machine was joined to Entra ID and not hybrid joined to begin with, because then you would have a lot of additional steps to remove it from AD to simulate the out-of-the-box experience, the OOBE. And we're not going to cover that in this lab, in this tutorial, in this demonstration. So for those of you that are following along in your own lab, the next steps would be appropriate. For those that are testing with a single device that was added from the manufacturer OEM, then you can skip these first few steps. When we arrive at the out-of-the-box experience at OOBE, it'll be the same for either scenario. So to trigger the out-of-the-box experience from a machine that was already joined to Entra ID, I'm going to first go to Devices, then Windows, select the device, and click on Autopilot Reset. This will trigger a fresh start in an Autopilot Reset so that we can simulate the out-of-the-box experience at OOBE. We'll have to wait a few minutes, probably up to a half an hour or more. It's just a matter of time for Intune to sync with that local device. And what you'll see is that that device will restart. At least in this scenario for Autopilot Reset. Okay, so now we're at the out-of-the-box experience. We'll go ahead and sign in. Let's give it a few minutes. Autopilot is doing its thing. So we'll take a pause on this progress screen and we'll come right back. It's going to do a mandatory reboot. Autopilot is continuing to set up. It's giving us a status on all the steps in the autopilot. We can click on these. And get some more information. And we got a status of completed. And now we will log onto the machine. You can expect this part to take a little while as it wraps things up. It's continuing the Autopilot configuration. So we see that the Autopilot provisioning process completed. Now we have to go through and validate a few things. Indeed, the device was joined to Active Directory through the Intune Connector, the online connector for AD, with the prefix that we specified in some random digits. So what we want to do next is actually rename that device through Active Directory. And it did import it to the correct OU. We'll go ahead and rename this computer. In a production environment, you can script this through Active Directory and PowerShell. We'll give it a restart, and then we'll do a directory synchronization sync to sync the new name to Entra ID. So let's continue to verify a few more things, starting with the Hybrid Azure AD Join state and the Intune Enrollment state. So if we go to Entra ID and go to Devices, All Devices, and search for the device, we can see the device is in there. We can see the join type is Microsoft Entra Hybrid Joined. And we can also see that it is managed by MDM, which is Intune, and it's compliant. If we look at the device from the Intune side of the house, we take a look at the device configuration, we see that the domain join succeeded. And if we look at the managed apps, the application that I deployed for the Autopilot deployment phase succeeded. And if we actually check the application on this device, we will see that indeed it did install. So we verified everything. I count this as a successful Autopilot Hybrid Entra Join deployment. That wraps up all the steps, all the installations and configurations necessary. If you enjoyed this video, you can always buy me a cup of coffee at the link below. Consider subscribing, like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for notifications. Click the alert notification bell. And check out my other videos. I really hope you enjoyed this. I hope it brought you some knowledge, and I hope you gain from this experience.